Hi everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we're going to be looking at Starlette, which is an ASGI framework, and it also provides a toolkit that can allow us to be able to use some functionality within other web frameworks. Now if you have noticed, Starlette is the tool that is actually one of the tools that was used to build Fast API. So in this video, I'm going to be building a simple web application using Starlette, and I hope you guys follow along and learn from this video. Now right here, I have an empty folder open up with my VS Code, and this is where I'm going to be coding our simple web application. So open up my terminal, and the first thing I'll do is to basically create a virtual environment and then install our project dependencies. So I'll do that with Python, actually Python, then I'll call -m. So I'm going to call them as a command and then go ahead and create this virtual environment as env. So when I create this virtual environment as env, what I'll do is to activate it and then go ahead and install all the requirements for our project. So now that our virtual environment has been created, let's go ahead and activate it. So here I'm going to just say source and env. So this is Windows, so I'll just have to call scripts and activate. So this will go ahead and activate our virtual environment. So go ahead and install our Starlette as well as uvicorn, because uvicorn is going to allow us to actually run our server since it's going to be asynchronous. So I'll just simply come here and install uvicorn. So I'm going to close this, and after it has actually been installed and our uvicorn has also been installed, so I'm simply going to come right here, and what I have to do is to first pip freeze these two requirements.txt file. So I'll do that with pip freeze and then requirements.txt. It's actually going to be txt. And after doing that, then the first thing I'll do is to basically create our main.py module where we're going to write our server code. So I'm going to create this file, which is going to be our main.py, and within this file, I'm going to close my terminal for now. Within this file, we're going to create an instance of Starlette that's going to allow us to create our application. So I begin by importing our Starlette class. So I'll come and say, sorry for this, I'll just come and start with from Starlette. This case is going to be from Starlette. We're going to go ahead and import our Starlette class. It's actually from the Starlette applications package. We're going to go ahead and import our Starlette class. And right after creating this Starlette class, then we're going to go ahead and create an app instance using our Starlette class. Now this takes in a variety of arguments, and the first one is going to be our debug, which is going to be true so that you can be able to get errors and be able to trace back to where these errors actually come from. So I'm going to come and provide this debug as true, and now also provide a list of routes that's going to basically describe the various routes that are going to lead us to the various endpoints. So I just come right in here and I provide routes, and this is going to be a list of routes. So I'll create a variable called routes. Now this variable called routes is going to be an empty list for now, but we're going to look at how we shall add our routes inside here. So to create a route, we shall use the route function, and we're going to import that from starlette.routing. So we're going to go ahead and import our route class. So right after importing route, I'm just simply going to come and create instances of route. So each instance of route is going to be mapped onto a function that's going to allow us to basically turn an HTTP request into an HTTP response. So right in here within our route, we shall specify a path, which is a URL, as well as an endpoint. Now, in this case, the endpoint is going to be the function that's going to allow us to return an HTTP response. So I'll say that you're going to have a function called index. So we're going to leave it for now, and let's go ahead and create this index function. Now, the way we create endpoints is by using the async await syntax. So in this case, we're going to define a function we shall call our index function. So this function takes in a request, which is of type request. So I'm simply going to import our request class. So I'll just come and say from Starlette, and in this case we shall have requests. In this case we shall have to import our request class, and each request we put into as our function or our endpoint is going to be type request. So now we have to return some specific HTTP response. So the way we do that is by simply returning it. Now I'm going to import a certain response. So let's first look at how we can return it, just a plain text response. So I'm going to go ahead and use Starlette's inbuilt response package. And in this case, I'm going to just simply return the plain text response. And by using this, we can be able to just return a string or a response with just a message. So I'll just come and do that by saying return. In this case, we shall return our plain text response. And this is just going to simply have the content as a string having hello and then world. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and once I save this, so I'm seeing some formatting things here. I'm going to say no, don't show again because I don't want it to pop up again. Now to run our server I'm just simply going to come, and what I'll do is to pull up my terminal. It's like I've seen something that we didn't actually need. I'm going to remove this debug from these tutorials, and I'm going to pull up our terminal once again, and I'm going to come, and what I have to do to run our server is by saying uvicorn, and in this case we shall specify our main module, which is our main.py file right here, and then we shall also provide our app instance, which we have created with app is equal to Starlette. Now after doing that, then I'll pass in the reload option. And by doing this, I'm specifying that if there are changes in our server code, then we need our server to restart as we are developing. So I'm going to run this, and this is going to run our server. So we're being told that our uvicorn server is being run on localhost 8000. So let's actually try to visit this link. So I'm going to control and click this link, and this is going to, sorry for this. So I'm basically going to go to our Chrome. Sorry for this. So when I go to my Chrome right here, I'm just going to go to our localhost 8000, and right here we can see our response of hello world. Now this is not the only response we can return with Starlette. We can return other responses such as JSON responses as well as HTML templates. So let's go ahead and return a JSON response. Now I'm going to create an endpoint that's going to be responsible for doing this. So I'll just come right here, and all I have to do is to provide an endpoint. So this is going to be our JSON endpoint, and this JSON endpoint is going to take in request, and we can specify the type, which is going to be of type request, and then we return our JSON response. So I'm going to import JSON response from Starlette's inbuilt responses. I'll just come and do that with JSON response, and then I'll come right down here and say that this is going to be a JSON response. So the JSON response also takes in the content, and this content has to be something that we can basically serialize. So I'm just simply going to provide the dictionary. This dictionary is going to have a message, and let's say this message is going to be hello, and then let's say world. So I'm going to be saving this. Our server is running fine. So when I go back to our Chrome right here, and let's say we visit the slash JSON endpoint or the slash JSON route, it's not found. So let's actually go ahead and create a route for that specific endpoint. I'll just come right here. I'll create the route, and this route is going to be slash JSON. Let me actually make it lowercase, so it's going to be slash JSON. So in here, I'll provide our endpoint, and our endpoint in this case is going to be JSON endpoint. So when I go ahead and save this, when you head over to our Chrome and I refresh, we now see that our JSON response has been returned for us, which is fine. So let's go ahead and look at how we can be able to return an HTML template using Starlette. So the way we return HTML templates is by using a templating engine. Now the default templating engine Starlette allows us to use is actually the Ginger 2 templating engine. So we're going to be making use of that, but to do that, we're actually going to first import our Ginger2 templates class. So I'll just come and say from Starlette, in this case, we shall specify that we need a templating package. And from this, we're going to import our Ginger2 templates. Right after importing these Ginger2 templates, we're going to create our templates variable and simply going to be an instance of type Ginger2. So within here, we can specify the directory, and this directory is just going to be where we want our templates to be put. In this case, I'll come and specify that we want all our templates to be located within our templates directory. I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now, to create an endpoint that returns an HTML template, what we shall do in this case is to define this with async, and then I'll say def, and in this case, I'll just have to call this our HTML endpoint. And this is going to take in a request, which is going to be of type request, and then we shall return and a response, so an HTTP response. But in this case, we're going to return an actual HTML template. So then we're going to do that by specifying templates, and then we're going to return a template response. Now what you need to provide in here is going to be the name of that specific HTML template that we want to return. So I'll say that we want to return an index.html page, and I'll go ahead and create this. So I'll pull up my folder here and then create a folder, or actually create a file. So I'll create this file by saying it's going to be template/index.html. And right now we have this, so I'm going to put some boilerplate HTML code in here and an h1. This h1 is going to be having hello world. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now let's try to actually create a route for this. Now I'm simply going to come within our routes and I'll provide our route. So this route is going to be /HTML, and then I'm going to create its endpoint. So I'm just going to simply attach it to our HTML endpoint we have created here. And now I'm going to save. And when I save, we're going to go back to, sorry for this, we're going to go back to our Chrome right here. And when you go back to our Chrome, I'm going to go to the /HTML route. And in this case, it seems like we're having an error. So let's try to go back here. So we are being told that to use Ginger2 templates, we actually need to have Ginger2 installed, which we never installed. Now I'm just simply going to stop our server with Control and C. And after stopping it, I'm going to do pip install. And then I'm going to install Ginger2. Now, right after installing Ginger2, what you shall need to do is to pip freeze it to our requirements.txt. So I'll just come and say pip freeze. Actually, let me see if I created that. It's here. So let's go ahead and pip freeze it to our requirements.txt. And that is actually going to add it to our requirements.txt. Now let's go ahead and basically be able to visit our endpoint. So when I go back to our Chrome page right here and refresh, let's actually see what's happening. It seems like we still have an error. We did not run our server. So to automate this whole process of running our server, I'm going to be using a shell script, which is going to allow me to basically run the shell script and be able to run our server. I'm just simply going to create a file here, which I'm going to call my run.sh. This is going to work for me because I'm using a bash shell for now. And in this case, I'll have to find out which bash I'm using because I'm using bash terminal. So it's /usr bin and bash. I'll simply come and copy this, and then I'll come within my shell script right here, and I'll provide shebang, and then I'll basically paste in where our bash executable is. So within here, I'm just simply going to run the command that's going to run our bash terminal, or that's going to run our server. So in this case, it's going to be uvicorn, and then I'll specify that we need main and then app. So I'll pass in also our reload option. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this and close this. Now shall need this executable file to be executable, so I'll come and make it executable by running chmod, and then I'll say +x. Then I'll specify run.sh. So in the ls, we can now see it's an executable. So to run our server, I can just simply come and say /run sh, and it will go ahead and run our server. So right now, let's go ahead and basically look at our template. So when you go back here, we now see that we actually have an error here. So to create an HTML template, we actually need to pass in an argument that's going to be the context. The context is a dictionary that basically allows us to know which variables we use in our template. So in this case, what we need to do is to go ahead and provide it as a second argument to our template response function. So I'm going to head over right here, and all I have to do is to come and create our context. So this context is going to be a simple dictionary, and once you have this dictionary, I'm going to provide a must, or the first value, which is a must, which is actually the request object that we use. I'll come and provide it here. So I'm going to say that we're going to have our request, and this will be the request that we actually passed within our function here. So I'll just come within here and then provide our context. So this context is actually going to be our context that we created right here. So after saving, let's go back to our Chrome right here. When I refresh, we now see that our HTML template has been rendered. Now that our HTML template has been rendered, let's try to play around with our HTML template. So I'm going to go back to our Visual Studio Code right here, and I'm going to look into things such as path parameters and query parameters. So a path parameter is one we pass into the URL. For example, let's say I wanted to get a student by the ID. We can maybe say that our root endpoint is going to take in our student ID, and let's say we can even specify the type of that student ID to be an integer. And once we have this, now we can be able to get it in our root endpoint. So I can just come right here, and the way we get that is by using our request object. So I'll just say that we're going to have a student ID, and this student ID is going to be from our request object. So in this case, we shall access it by accessing our parameters, and in this case, we shall get our key, which is going to be our key of student ID. Now that we have this, it's actually student ID. So when we have this, we can be able to return this within our request or within our response. So I'm just going to come right here, and all I have to do is by saying that, let's say our content is going to be an F string, and this F string is going to have our student ID. And in this case, I'll just provide our student ID and then save, hoping that our server is still running. I'm going to go back to our Chrome right here, and let's try to access our root endpoint or our root URL with a student ID of 1. Now in this case, we see that we're going to return a plain text response of hello number 1. Now that's working successfully. Let's also look at how we can be able to return a query parameter. Now the way we deal with query parameters is, let's say in this case we wanted to actually return a query parameter. So let's say wanted to return a query parameter on the same URL. What I can do is to just come right here, and let's say we're going to have a student name, and in this case I can just come and say request dot. In this case, what we can access are the query parameters, so I can access it within query parameters, and then I can access it by saying dot get, and then let's say we need to access the student name provided within our query parameters. So if we have this, I can even actually say or none. That's when we've not provided anything. So let's say we're going to return world. So let's say in this case we want to return the student name. So what I'm going to do is to return the student name. So I can just come here and provide a student name. So when I go ahead and save this, when you head over to our URL right here and you try to refresh, what we return is a string of hello world. Now let's say we provide our query parameter. So providing our query parameter, I'm just simply going to come within our URL right here, localhost 8000, and then I'll provide our student name. So I'll just come and say question mark student name. And in this case, let's say our student name is going to be Jonathan. I'll make this request, and now we'll see if we can be able to return our optional query parameter. So we can do a lot of things in our Ginger template. For example, in this case, within our context, we can still return some other interesting things. So let's say within our template on our index.html, I can just come and provide our student name. So I can just come here and provide our student name. and the student name can be uh, John Doe. So once we have the student name, I can come and pass it within our context. So it's actually going to be our student name. So I can just come and say that we're going to have a key as a name and then the value which is going to be our student name. Now once we have this within our context, we can be able to actually bring it within our index.html, and instead of saying hello world, we can come and say hello name. So when I go back right here on our Chrome, let's try to visit that specific endpoint of slash HTML, and this is actually going to return our name, John Doe. So our HTML templates are actually working fine. So let's go ahead and look at how we can be able to play around and basically build a web application with this. So the first thing I'm going to do is to use SQLAlchemy to create a database that's going to have some kind of data that we're going to deal with dynamically within our templates. So what I'm going to do is to first install SQLAlchemy. So I'm going to stop our server for now, and I'm going to install SQLAlchemy. So when I install SQLAlchemy, it's going to basically give us the ability to create a database using a Python class that's going to allow us to basically create a database. Now that our SQLAlchemy has been installed, I'll also go ahead and freeze it within our requirements.txt file. And right after doing that, now I'm simply going to run our server again. Actually, I won't run it, but let's first create our database tables. So I'm going to create our model classes that are going to describe our database table. In this case, we're just simply going to model a simple database table that's going to allow us to provide some kind of dynamic data on our front end template. So I'll just come right in here, and all I have to do is to create our model. So I'll create a new file and call this file models.py. I'll also create another file that I'm going to call database.py. So within models.py, I'm simply going to go ahead and create our model class. But before we actually go into modeling our database table, let's first draw a picture of our database table. So I'm just simply going to have a class, and this class is going to be of type student. Now I'm just simply going to store some student data in our database, and we shall be able to play around with that on our template. So I'm going to provide a name. So let's say each student has a name, which is going to be a string, and each student can have, let's say, an age, which is going to be an integer. We can also have a random registration number, and this can also be text or a string. Now we're going to build such a table using SQLAlchemy. So to build our table, I'm going to go to database.py, and I'll have to first create some variables that are going to be useful for that. The first thing I'm going to do is to create an engine. So this engine variable is going to allow us to describe which database we're going to use and where it's going to be located. So to create our database, I'll have to first import the create engine function from SQLAlchemy. You can actually check out my videos on SQLAlchemy. So in this case, I'm just going to start by saying from SQLAlchemy, we are going to import our create engine function. And once you import this create engine function, we're going to create our engine as a call to the create engine function. Now this takes in the path or where we want our database to be. Now in this case, we shall have to describe where I want this database to be, or we're going to actually form a query string. So I'm going to import OS, and it's going to allow us to get where I want to put our database. So I'm just going to create a base variable, and this is going to be the name of our folder or the path of our folder. So it's actually going to point to this exact point of our folder where we have our root. So I'm just simply going to come right here, and then I'll say os.path. In this case, I'll say that we shall have our done name, and what we shall have here is a path, and this path will be our root path to our file, or the file we're actually editing right now. So once we have this, now we shall need to create a connection string. So I'm just going to say we shall have our connection string, and this is going to be os.path, and in this case we shall just come and basically join our base dir to the name of our database. So in this case, we're going to join our base dir variable to the name of the database we may want. So I'm just going to come and call it students.db. And right after doing that, then we also need to connect this to our SQLite. So in this case, I'll just come and say that we're going to use SQLite. So you can feel free to use MySQL or Postgres, but I've chosen SQLite since it's a simple database and we don't need a server to run it. So I'm just going to come provide it with SQLite and save. Now that we have this saved, we're going to just come and provide it here as our connection string, and then I also come and specify that we want our echo to be true. We want to just see a SQL that will be generated each time we add or delete or create our tables and so on. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and after saving this, now we're going to be able to create our base class. So the base class is what is going to allow us to create our database tables. Now to create our base class, I'll have to import declarative base from SQLAlchemy. So I'm going to do that is by saying from SQLAlchemy .ext .declarative, I'm going to go ahead and import our declarative base function. Right after creating this declarative base function, I'm simply going to come right here and say base. It's going to be declarative base. And once I have this, I'm going to go ahead and save. And right after saving this, now I'm just simply going to go to unmodels.py and then start creating our database table. So I'm going to come at the top of our code here and I'll first import our base. So I'll import it from our database module. And right after importing this, now each table class is going to be a class. Sorry for this. I'm actually also going to remove this. So each table class or each model class that describes our database table is a class that inherits from our base class. So I'll just come and say class. In this case, we shall create our student, and this student is going to be inheriting from base. Right after doing this, now we need to specify which name our table is actually going to have. So I'll just do that with table name, and our table name in this case is going to be equal to, so I'll just basically call our table students. Now each of our tables will need an ID, which is going to be a primary key, so I'll provide it. I'll just come and say that our ID is going to be a column. I'm going to import all of those attributes from SQLAlchemy. So I'll come and say from SQLAlchemy, we are going to import our column, also going to import string and integer, and we're going to use this to basically create our table. So I'm just going to come and provide our ID as a column. Now this column is going to be an integer, so I'll just come and provide this as an integer, and it's also going to be the primary key. So I'll just come and say that this column will be our primary key column, which is going to be true. So right after doing this, now I'm going to give our name. So our name is going to be a string, and in this case, which is going to actually be a column, which is something I forgot. So we're going to provide our column as a string, and then we also provide our column age, which is going to be a column, and this column will be an integer. So right after doing this, now I'm simply going to create some functions. They're going to help us to return a string representation. Actually, one function that's going to return a string representation of each student that we shall create. So I'll do that with def, and shall have repre, and in this case we shall have self. It's actually going to be self. So right in here, we shall just return a string representation of our object. So in this case, we shall return the student and then the name of the student. So I'll say self.name. Okay, now that we've done this, let's go ahead and look at how we can create our database using this student table. So I'll just come within our files, and what I'll do is to create a new file. I'm going to call this file, sorry for this, I'm actually going to call this file create db.py. So it's actually going to be create db.py. And when I have this, I'm simply going to go ahead and create our database. So I have to import our base class. So I'm just going to import our base class from our database module. So just come and say base. And then also going to have our engine. So we're going to pass in our engine. Now that we have this, you also need to import our models. So I'll just simply come here and say from models, we are simply going to go ahead and import our student class. Now that we have that, we are going to use our base class to be able to create our database tables in our SQLite database. So I'm simply going to come right here and say base dot, this case shall say metadata dot create all, and then I'll provide our engine. So I need to bind this to one engine, and in this case our engine is going to be the engine we created. Sorry for this, it's actually going to be our engine. Now that we have this, I'm going to go ahead and save, and hoping that everything is fine, I'll pull up my terminal and I'll run Python create db.py. So this is going to be able to create our database, and now we can even see the SQLAlchemy SQL statement that's actually generated. So we're creating a table with an ID column, a name, an age, and it has its primary key as the ID. Now let's go ahead and try to play around with the different data that we may have in our table. So I think we're going to run our server, and when I run our server, it's going to start our server. So the first thing we shall need to do is to return all our students or our student records. Now simply going to create a file in here where I'm going to write all of those functions that are going to help us to create, read, update, and delete our students. So I'm thinking of a random name, and I'll just simply give it db.py. So I'm just simply going to use db.py to go ahead and write those functions. So I'll go back to our database module, and the first thing I'll do is to create a session class. And this session class shall help us to create sessions that will allow us to basically go ahead and create, read, update, and delete our students. So I'm just going to come and import that from SQLAlchemy.orm. Let's say from SQLAlchemy.orm, we are going to import our session maker. It's actually our session maker class. And this session maker class is going to allow us to create a class. So I'm just going to come and say, we're going to create our session as an instance of a session maker class. And then once we have this, we're going to go to our db.py and import it. So I'll say from database, we are going to import our session. And right after having our session, we shall also need our model. So I'll say from models, we are going to import our, in this case, it's going to be on our student. And using our session, we shall need to create some sort of local session. So this local session is what actually helps us to use our database in this module. So I'll just come and say that we shall have a local session, and this local session is going to be equal to our session. So it's going to be an instance of our session. And right after doing that, now we're going to create a function that's going to simply return all of our students. So I'm just going to come and call that function get all students. So it's going to be querying our database and returning all our students. So in this case, I'll just come and return. So we're going to use our local session to query our database. So in this case, I'm going to say dot query. Then we shall pass in our model for student. And in this case, I'll just come and say, oh. Now let's go ahead and use this within our URL, so within our endpoint, so that you can be able to actually return all students. I'm just simply going to come within here, and within our HTML endpoint, I'll simply come in here, and I'm also going to create a variable called grades. And this grades variable is simply going to return our grades. So I'm going to import our grades, get all grades. I mean, actually, it's actually going to be a student. Sorry for this. So this will be students, and I'm simply going to come right here, and all I have to say is from, in this case I'll just say from our db module, we're going to import our get all students. So I'll just come here and say that our students is going to be get all students, and I'm going to provide this within our context. So I'll just come and say that inside here we shall have a key students, and the value will be students. So when I go ahead and save this, when you head over back to our template, I'm going to be looping through all of our students on our template. I'm just simply going to come here, I'll get rid of some of this, and what I have to do is to basically say for this case, let's actually create a student table. So I'm going to create a table, and this table is going to have a class of table. I may end up styling this with Bootstrap, so that's why I'm actually using Bootstrap classes. So I'm going to call this a table. So this table is going to have a table head. And, oh, sorry for this. So this table head will have different heads. So we shall have the ID first, and then we shall go ahead and have our, in this case, we shall have our name, and we shall also go ahead and use our age, and then we shall also have, so let's actually look at what we did in our models. We have name, age. We can also add our registration number. I'm going to add it, so I'll just come right here and provide our registration number. Now the reason that's why I'm doing this without doing migrations is because we haven't yet added some data into our database. So since we are using SQLite, I'm going to delete that database and then rerun the createDB script. So I'll just come here and say registration number. So this registration number is going to be colon and then shall be our text. So I'm going to import text from SQLAlchemy and save. So right after doing this, I'm going to go to our files and then get rid of our student.db SQLite file. And I'm going to stop our server, Control and C, and then I'll create a database again with Python, createDB.py. So our database has been created right now, and in this case, it actually has that specific row for registration number. So I'll run our script again, and when I run our server, so we're going to go ahead and look through each and every one of the rows in our database to return our list of students. Now here, what I'm doing is to actually create a table head or a table heading, and this table heading is going to be for our registration number. So once we have this, now I can also come and provide our table body. So this table body is actually going to be having our rows that are going to come from our database. So in this case, I'll loop over all of our data in our database. So since we declared our students in our context, I can just simply come here and say for student in students, and then what you can do is to basically return a row. So in this case, I'll return a table, and this table is going to be having different columns. So the first column we shall have is the student ID. So I'll provide that. If you're wondering how I'm auto-completing my for loops, I'm using a VS Code extension called Janero. I hope you can be able to look for it and install it. It will make your life easier. So I'm just simply going to come and say that you shall have the student ID, and then we are going to basically create the student name, and then you shall also have the student age. So in this case, I'll come and say that you shall have the student age, and right after doing that, you shall also need the student registration number. So I'll just simply come right in here and then provide the student registration number. So I'll just say registration number. So when I go ahead and save this, since you do not have this, when I go to our template right here, we actually don't have this, so we cannot bind, we don't have an engine bound. This actually section that we are using is not bound to an engine. So let's go ahead and do that. So when I go back to our code here, I'm going to go back to our db.py. We created that section but did not bind it to an engine, so I'll have to import our engine. And I'm going to come here and bind this session. I'll say bind is equal to engine and save. I'm hoping that our server is going to run. When you go back here and refresh, we now see that we have a table having ID, name, age, and registration number. So what I'll do in this case is to basically style this up with Bootstrap. Now Bootstrap is a tool that's going to allow us to add some nice styling onto our table as well as our template in general. So I'm going to go to the Bootstrap website. I'll just come and say that we need Bootstrap CDN. So I'm simply going to add that to our template. So I'll just come and go to Bootstrap, and right here I'll simply go to the JS deliver part, copy the link. So head over to our HTML template, which is our index.html. And what I have to do is to paste that link within our head tag. And when I place it within our head tag, when you go back to our template right here, you're going to notice that our CSS for our table is going to change. But what I'll do is to actually return all of our body are located within our container. So I can actually come and say that our body is going to have a class of container. I'm going to be using Bootstrap classes, and it's going to help us to style our work. So right now we see that our table is actually located within our Bootstrap container. So I'm also going to create a header. So since we're using Jinja 2 templates, we can actually be able to use headers or use includes. So includes allow us to get a specific HTML page or HTML code and then insert it somewhere, as we're going to be seeing. So for now, let's go ahead and create our header. So I'm just simply going to come within our templates folder. I'll create a file I'll call this file, it's actually going to be an HTML file, which I'm just going to call header.html. So my header.html in this case is going to have our header. So I just simply come here and provide our header. I'll provide a link, and this is going to be a link to our home page, and save. Now after saving this, I'm simply going to go ahead and include this within our HTML. Now since we're using Jinja 2 templates, you can just simply do that easily by coming and saying includes. And in this case, we can include the HTML we want to include. So in this case, it's going to be header.html. So when I go back here in our HTML and I refresh, we now see that our home is being provided to us. So I'm going to provide a Bootstrap class over header to make it a navbar. So let's come and provide a class. This will be our navbar, and then nav. And when we move back here, you now see that we are having our home page as a navbar. So also come and provide our link. So this, I'll just give this a class of nav link to change it to a Bootstrap link. Now when you save, we actually have our home link as a Bootstrap link. Alright, so now our stuff is working. So the next thing we're going to do is to create a simple form that's going to be helping us to create a student. So what I'm going to do is to head over to our link here. So I'm just going to create a link, and this link is going to basically help us to go to that part where I create a student. So in this case, I'll just come and say that we're going to create a student. And when I come here and refresh, now have the next link as created student. Now also going to give that a class of nav link. And in this case, I'll say that our class is going to be nav link. So when I come and save, we now have two links, for one for creating a home, one to go into our home, as well as one for going to our student. Let's create that endpoint for creating a student. So what I'm going to do is head over to our main.py file, and I'll have to create the endpoint. So I'm just simply going to come here and say that's going to be async def, and I'll provide the name. So in this case, we shall say create students. It's going to be the name of the route. So this will take in a request. So you're going to type request, and then we'll return a response. So in this case, our response is going to be a template response. So I'll say template response, and then right in here we shall provide a template. So in this case, let's just call it create.html, and then we shall also have a context. So our context in this case is going to be a dictionary. So I'll create it here. I'm actually going to specify it's going to be a dictionary. So the first thing we shall have to pass in is going to be our request, and within our request we shall also have to pass in, actually let's just leave it to the request for now. So I'm going to save, and when you head over right here, I'm going to save, and let's try to figure out ways of redirecting to the different pages. Now here we can be able to redirect, but we are not redirecting actually because we do not have an href specified in the links. So when I come to our index.html, each time we provide our request in our context, it provides for us the URL for function, and this will allow us to redirect to different pages. So I'll go to the header.html page right here, and within our header.html, we're going to use our URL for function, to basically specify which endpoint to redirect to, in case we click on a certain link. And in this case, I'll say var and here I'll say URL for, and in this case I'll come and say that I want to redirect, so I have to specify the name of the exact endpoint. So let's say we're navigating to slash or our root URL, I have to keep in mind the name of the endpoint, which is index. So in this case, I'll just come and say that our index is going to be the name of the endpoint, and I'm also going to come here and provide the name of our endpoint here. So I'll say URL for, and this case we shall have it for creating students. So this is actually going to be our URL for creating students. I'll come and provide it within our header and save. Now when I go back right here and refresh, we now see that no route exists for index and params. Actually, this is going to be for our HTML endpoint. Sorry for this. So we are actually going to have this route as the one for our HTML endpoint, because that's what is actually rendering our main HTML template. So it's actually HTML endpoint. So when I refresh, now see no route exists for create student and params that. So it seems like we have params for that specific endpoint. Let's actually create the route. I'm just simply going to come right here and provide our route for creating students. Now provide the path as create student, and then I provide the endpoint, and this endpoint is going to be for creating a student. And when I save, we're going to go back here. So I'll try to save this. So when you try to go to creating a student, it's actually telling us that it's not finding the template. So let's actually go ahead and create the template. So I'll just come in here. So since this is Ginger, we can be able to do template inheritance to organize our layout for all of our templates. I'm just simply going to come and create a base.html file. So I'll copy both the header as well as the footer of all our pages, so that we have that uniformity across our application. I'm just simply going to come in here and I'll copy the header and all the parts that go in the header and the head section. I'll also copy where our page is ending. That excludes the table. So in this case, I'm just going to come and add all of that in here. So once you have that, now have to basically specify where our content is going to be. So it's going to be within our block tags here. So we shall have block content and then block content. Now I'll do the same thing within our index.html file. So all this content needs to live within our block tags. So I'm simply going to remove our table. And now we're going to start by saying that this template is going to be extended from base.html. And after doing that, then we shall also need to basically place the content where it needs to be. So I'll open our block tags and I'll simply paste in our content. So when I go back here and refresh, we actually don't have our create.html, so I'm simply going to come and create a new file. I'll call this create.html. Now I'll do the same thing, so I'll just come and say extends, and this will extend from base.html. And now I'll just come and say that we're going to have block. This is going to be block content. So once you have this, I'm just going to go ahead and basically create or basically add our content in here. So I'm going to, oh, so actually we don't have any content here, so I'm going to undo that. So when I save and head over to our template, right now we see that we're actually having a blank page, so we're going to be creating the HTML for this specific page. So I'm just going to create that very fast. We're going to have a div of class form. We actually call it form, and within this form we're going to have our form, and this form is going to have a method which is going to be a post method. Now when you have this, we are going to use Bootstrap classes to create a form that looks appealing. So I'm just simply going to create an h3, and this is going to be for creating a student. I'll just come and say that we're going to create a student, and right after doing that, then I'm going to write the fields for the labels and the fields for each of our fields. Now we're going to have a label, and this is going to be for our name, so we shall have a name. And we are going to also have And in this case, we are going to have our input, and this input is going to be of type text. So I'm actually using image to help me with this auto completion. I'll provide a class, and this class is going to be of form control. So I'm actually going to place each label and each field in a form group. So I'm just going to come and say that shall have a form group, and each form group is going to basically cover the label as well as the input. So I provide the name attribute as name, as going to allow us to get the form data. I'm simply going to copy this for the age, and I also do the same thing for our registration number. So in this case, I'm going to change this to our age. I'm also going to change the type of this input to integer, and I'm also going to change this to age. So I'll change this name to age, and also come in here and change this to registration number. So just going to remove this and change this to registration number. Then I'll come and also provide this as our registration number. So I'll just come and say that name is going to be registration number. So I'll provide that as well. Registration number. So I'm going to go ahead and save. So let's go back here. When I refresh, we now see our beautiful form created. So I'm just simply going to come, and what I'll have to do is to create another form group. So this form group is going to have an input, which is going to help us to save our data by submitting. So we shall say that the type is going to be submit, and then we shall have a value of add student. And I'll give this a class of btn, and then btn. Let's just say btn primary. So when you go back right here, we are now having our beautiful form, which you can be able to add, and then it will go ahead and save our student. Alright, so now everything is working. When you go to our homepage, you can be able to see our table that has our students. When you go to our create a student route, we can be able to see our page of creating a student. Now what we need in this case is to specify which action or what's going to happen when you submit this form. So we're going to go to our main.py, and in this case what we need is to basically handle the submitting of our data. So I'm going to, since we have this route being the same that has the form, I'm going to use both get and post methods. Now they will be able to specify that a route has both get and post methods is by coming to the route and basically providing the third argument as the methods. In this case, you can specify the methods to be get as well as post. So once we have this, now I'm going to go ahead and provide our URL as the action for that specific form for creating our student. Now the way I'm going to do that is by coming and copying our name for our endpoint. And I'm going to go to create.html, and I'll use URL for, so I'm just going to use var, then say URL for. In this case, I'll provide our URL for, so it shall be for create students, and then we shall have a method of post. So now our thing is going to work. So when you go back here and you try to submit this form, you now see it's actually working, and our server is actually posting to create student. So let's go ahead and be able to get our form data. So I'm just going to come within our main.py file, and I'll have to first specify that if the request method is post, then we are able to get our post data. In this case, I'm going to come and say if request dot method is going to be equal to post, and what we need in this case is going to be our data. So Starlette provides us a way to get our form data that submit via forms, and we get that from our request object. So I'm just going to come and say that our student data is going to be equal to, so in this case we're going to await request dot form. Now that we have this, we are simply going to print, let's actually just print the student data to just examine it, and then let's redirect to our endpoint of our home page. So I just come right in here. So we're actually going to use another response, which is going to be our redirect response. Now I'm just going to come at the top here, and then I'll have to the redirect response. Now that we have the redirect response, I'm simply going to come right here and return our redirect response. So the redirect response basically has its initial status code as 307. It also takes in the URL. So we shall have to first specify the URL. So I'm going to use our request object, and I'll say request.url for. Now in this case, we shall access the index route. We want to redirect to our home page, and then I'm going to specify our status code. And in this case, it's going to be a status code of actually it's going to be URL for index. I provide a status code, and this status code is going to be 303. And you may ask, why 303? Now the problem with 307 is like it provides a temporary redirect. Each time we are able to send our post request, we're going to just be redirected without the post request actually not happening. So we're going to use 303. That's going to allow us to basically specify that our resource is located on another URL, which is going to be the index URL. So for us to redirect, we have to actually go ahead and post the data. I'm going to go ahead and save. Our server is going to restart. So when our server restarts, let's actually try to submit this form with some data and be able to keep track of that data. I'm just simply going to come right here, I'll refresh our page. So they're telling us to continue our form resubmission. Just going to press continue. So right now we cannot be able to pass our forms, and this is because Python multipart is not installed. So to use our forms, we actually need to install Python multipart. So I'll just come right here and stop our server with Control and C. Then I'll go ahead and install Python multipart. Just say pip install Python and then multipart. So this is going to go ahead and install Python multipart. So I'll also freeze it within our requirements.txt. And after freezing it within our requirements.txt, now I'm simply going to go ahead and run our server again. So when I run our server, I'm going to try to refresh, continue our form resubmission, and they're telling us that no route exists for index. I don't know why I'm keeping on forgetting this. So I'm actually going to remove our index route or our index endpoint, or I'm just simply going to comment it, and then I'll come and specify that our index endpoint is actually going to be, I'm actually going to remove this route or to comment it. Now instead of /html, I'm going to change our root endpoint to our HTML endpoint, and I'm going to save this. So when I refresh, so in this case I'll have to go back to, so this is actually going to take us to our home page, which is going to return us to this root endpoint or our HTML endpoint. Now we are safe. When we go to create student, you can be able to actually go to create student. Now I'm actually going to also change that specific redirect, and I'm simply going to change this to redirect to our HTML endpoint. So I'll just come here and say we're going to return our HTML endpoint, and we shall have a status code of 303. So when I come here, I'll provide some data. So provide some dummy data, and then dummy numbers, some dummy data, and then submit. So now we are being redirected to our home page. So let's actually see what our server printed. So when you look here, we can be able to see that our form data is a dictionary that contains our name, our age, as well as our registration number. Now let's go ahead and write a function that's going to allow us to create a student. So I'm simply going to go within our db.py, and then I'm going to create a function. So I'm just going to come and say def create a student. I'll actually say create a student. I want it to be different from our endpoint. So just simply say that this requires us to have student data, and this student data is expected to be a dictionary. So once we have the student data, we shall create a new student, and we shall just unpack the new student data. So I'll just come and say that our new student is going to be student, and then right in here we shall have to say star star, and then we shall put our student data. So once you have this, then I'm going to simply go ahead, and what I'll do is to use our local session to save this student. So I'll use our try cache or I'll try except in this case because it's Python. And what I'll do is to say local session dot add. So in this case, we're going to add a new student, and we're going to go ahead and also commit this student to our database. So just simply say local session dot commit, and there's instances in which you may need to roll back this session. So I'm just simply going to come and say that in case we have not been able to save the student, then we shall just have to roll back our session. So we shall do that is by saying except, and in this case I'll come and say local session dot, in this case I'll just say roll back. And finally, we shall need to close this session. So I'll just come and say finally. In this case, we shall say local session dot close. So right after doing this, now we're going to use this function to be able to create a student. So I head over to our main.html. And within our main.html, I'm simply going to go ahead and create a student using this data we have here. So I'm simply going to come right here and say, I actually have to first import our function. So I'll just say create a student. So I'm simply going to call this function right here. And I'll just say create a student. And this is going to be, it's going to need student data. So I'll provide our student data. So let's try to actually see if this is going to work. So when I go back here, I'm going to go to create a student, and then I'll provide a name. So I'll provide the name of John Doe, and then provide an age 24. I'll provide a registration number, and when I try to add this student, we now see student is not defined. So let's actually see. Um, let's actually see where that is going to be. See, it's actually in line 28. Let's actually see where that is. So student, let's actually see where that is. So it's saying that we don't, student is undefined, and I think that's actually in our index.html. So it's actually here. So I'm just going to simply save that. So when I refresh, we now see that our student has actually been added. So let's actually try to create another student. So I'm going to create a student with a name Jendo, and then I'll provide our age, and our age is going to be 21. Shall provide our registration number, and when I add this, we now see that our student has actually been added. Now let's add some other buttons that are going to allow us to update and delete this student. I'm simply going to come to our index.html page and have adding two extra buttons or two extra anchor tags. So in this case, I'm going to add an anchor tag, and this is going to have a class of btn and btn of, let's say, info. So this is actually going to be our update button, and I'm going to do the same thing. So I'll simply copy this and then paste it in here, and then we're going to have this as a button of danger, and this is going to allow us to delete a specific student. So when I refresh, now have our buttons created for us. Okay, this now looks beautiful. So let's go ahead and basically update our students. So I'm going to need to go to our main.py. So I'll create an endpoint that's going to allow us to go ahead and update a student. I'm simply going to come in here and I'll create this with async. I'll provide this with update. It's actually going to be update a student, and in this case we shall have a request, and then we shall have this request being equal to being of type request, and then once we have this request, I'm simply going to return an HTML page. So I'll say templates, and in this case we want to return a template response, and in this case I'll just simply return a template that's going to be update.html. Now after having this, we expect to return a context, so I'll provide our context, and this context is going to be a context we are going to create. Actually, let me just leave it to the context. So I'll provide this context in here, and we're going to simply have the first value in our context as our request object. So I'll provide it in here, and I'll create a route for this. So this update student route is actually going to need a student ID because you're going to be able to query for that specific student you want to update. So I'll try to get the student ID by coming right here. I'll just come and say that shall need the student ID, and this will be good from the query parameter. So shall say shall going to need a request, and in this case shall say request dot path params, and shall need to get the student ID. So once I get the student ID, now let me create a function that's actually going to help us to get this specific student. Now to do that, I'll go back to our db.py, and within our db.py, I'll create a specific function. So I'll create a function that's going to get a student by, in this case, it's actually going to be getting a student by the ID. So we're going to need the ID. It's going to be the student ID. Now we're going to use our local session to query for this particular student. So I'll just say this function is just simply going to return local session dot query. And in this case, you'll have to provide a student. And in this case, after querying for our student, we actually need to filter by the ID. So if our ID is equal to our student ID, then we need the first object that has that specific attribute. So I'm going to use this to return our student. Now come back to our main.py, and I'm actually going to close this. So I'll just come here and search for our main.py. Oh, it's actually going to be the main.py of our app. And when I come within our main.py, I'm just simply going to use that function to return that student using the student ID we get from our query parameters. So I'll have to import it here, say get student by ID. And then after getting the student by the ID, what you shall need is to get the student. So I'm going to get a student, and I'm just simply going to call this student to update. And this is going to be equal to get a student by the ID. Now that we have this, I'm going to pass this within our context. So I'll say comma, and then here I shall have a student, and this student is going to be student to update. So I'll save this, and since now we have this student within our context, now I'm going to copy the same HTML like we used for our create function to basically go ahead and update our student. I'm simply going to copy the same template. So we defined our template for that specific endpoint for updating a student, but we haven't actually added the route. Now simply going to come right in here, so say comma, and then provide our route. And in this case, our route is going to be one for update student. And here we shall have our student ID. So provide our student ID, which is going to be an integer. And then I'll provide our endpoint, and this endpoint is going to be the one for update a student. So now that we have this, let's go ahead and basically update our student. Now I'm going to simply create that endpoint for updating a student. So I'll provide our URL. So I'm just simply going to come and copy this update student URL, endpoint, and then provide it here within our index.html template. So I'll say var, and then this will be URL4. And then here we shall provide our updated student. Now since this has a path parameter, we shall need to specify it within our URL4 function. So I'll just come and say that we shall have our student ID be equal to the student.id. Well, in this case, it's actually going to be the student.id. So write it student.id. So when you head over to our template right here and refresh, when you go to update student, it's actually going to tell us that this actually is missing one argument, which is the student ID. So I'm going to go to our main.py and try to fix that. So here we need the student ID, which is actually got from our path parameters. So when I refresh, so we don't have the update.html page created. I'll simply go to our templates and create our file. So this is going to be update.html. And when you have this, I'm simply going to extend our base template, say base.html. So I'm going to provide a block, and this is going to be block content. So when you have this, I'm simply going to go ahead and provide the same HTML for our template. So I'm simply going to come within our create HTML. I'll actually copy the same template, and then I go back here and basically paste it. What I'll have to do is to change the action in here. So instead of having create students, in this case we're going to have updating a student. So I'll just simply come and say we're going to have update a student, and here we shall also provide student ID to be the ID of this particular student. It's going to be student ID, which will be student dot ID. So now that we have this, we're also going to provide values for that particular student so that they fill in our fields. I just come and provide the value attribute, and this value attribute is actually going to have, so here we shall have student dot name, and then we shall come here and let's say we're going to provide that value, and here we shall have student, and this is going to be student dot age, and right in here we shall also have, and this is actually going to be our student, oh sorry for this, it's actually going to be our value. So this value is going to be for our registration number, so provide this with var, and then shall provide a value which is going to be our registration number. It's going to come and say student registration number, and then go ahead and save. So when you head over right here and I refresh, now see that our template is being created. Now I'm going to also change the value here, so I'll just change this to update student and save. So when I refresh, we now see that's actually for updating a student. So right now, I'm going to change our value. So this is actually going to be for updating a student. So let's try to actually submit this. When I submit this, we actually see that the method is not allowed for this requested URL. So I'll go to our main.py file right here and go right here. So I have to specify our methods. And in this case, our methods are going to be get and post. So I have to change this and say methods is going to be equal to get as well as post. So in case we shall say method get and post. So now head over to our endpoint and try to continue. We now see that's actually returning us to the same page. So when I try to submit, it's actually returning us to the same page, it's not redirecting. Let's actually look within our update or HTML. We're having method of post and we're having this. So it's not doing anything for now because it doesn't have what happens when you send a post request. Alright, so let's try to get our form data. In this case, I'm going to come and say if request dot method is going to be equal to, let's say, our post method. What we need in this case is to basically get that data that comes from that post request. So in this case, I'm just going to simply say student update data. So I'm just simply going to call that the student update data. And the student update data is going to be a result of awaiting the request form or request.form. So for now, let's just print this out. So I'm just simply going to say print student update data, and then we shall have to redirect. So I'll just simply come and say return redirect response. So I'll provide the redirect response as our home page. Now in this case, I'm just going to come and say we're going to redirect request.url4, and in this case, I'll provide our HTML endpoint. So we shall also provide our status code, and this will be 303. Going to save. So when you go back here and try to update our student, we're going to go back to our endpoint for basically our home page. When you go right here, we're trying to find out that we've printed a dictionary containing our data. Now let's go ahead and use this data to update our form. So I'm just simply going to come, and what I'll do is to, in this case, what I'll do is to go to our data here, and I'll go to our DB. It's actually within our db.py file. Forgive me, I'm becoming a little bit lazy. So in this case, I'm going to say that we're going to update student. Actually, let's say we're going to update student data. And what we shall need first is going to be the student ID. Now, we're going to also need the student data that's going to come in from post request. So we're going to use our functions to get the student. So I'll just come and say student to update, and this is going to be equal to what we shall have here is get the student by the ID. And after getting the student by the ID, now we're going to go ahead and basically update the student data. So I'll just come and say student to update dot name, and in this case we shall have a name. So this name is going to be from our student data. So I'll just come and say student data, and in this case we shall access the name, and we're going to also do the same thing. So I'll just come and say student to update dot age. In this case our age is going to be student, actually it's going to be student data, and shall have our age. Now let's do the same thing for our registration number. So I'll just come and say student to update the registration number, and in this case it's going to be student to, actually it's going to be student data, and in this case we shall say that shall have a registration number. All right, now that we have this, let's actually go ahead and use our session to commit this. So to save this, that's what we're just going to say local session.commit, and we're going to go ahead and commit this. So after doing this, now let's go ahead and use this function to basically update our student. So I'll head over to our main.py, and within our post request, I'll simply come and remove our print statement here. So what I have to do is to basically say that we're going to update our student. So I have to import that function here. I'm going to tidy this a little bit. I'm just going to come, and what I do is to basically use this to tidy how I've imported these functions. I'm just simply going to come here. I'll say update student data. So after doing that, I'm going to come down where we have update student data. So I'm just going to come and basically state that we're going to update student data, and then I'll provide our student ID. So our student ID in this case is going to be our student ID. So provide that, and then I'll provide our student data as our student update data. So let's try updating our data in this case. So when you head over here, I'm going to go and update this. So let's say we're updating this to gender Smith, Will Smith. So I'm just going to basically create the age as 22, and when you try to actually we did not pass the student ID, so I'll have to go back in our db.py, and then here, I don't know why I keep forgetting this, is going to be a student ID. So when you go back here, I'm going to try to continue. So in this case, we see that our gender is actually updated. Now let's try to also change this to John Doe. I'm going to change this from John Doe to Will. So it's going to be Will Smith. Will Smith. So provide the age as 54, and when I save, we now have our student updated. All right, so let's go ahead and try to delete these students. So I'm going to try to create other students. So let's say Harry Potter, and let's say we're going to have age at 21, and then registration number is this. So when I add the student, it's actually going to be updated here. So let's try to actually delete the student. So I'm just simply going to go within our main.py file, and then within our main.py file, I'm going to create one last endpoint, and that's actually going to be for deleting a student. So I'll just simply come here and say it's going to take in a request, which is going to be of type request. And once you have that, actually I forgot that this is actually going to be a function, so I have to declare it and then go ahead and basically carry out the logic for deleting a student. Now I'm going to come to our db.py, and within our db.py, I'm simply going to come and write that specific function for deleting a student. So I'll just come and say delete student data, and in this case we shall say it's going to take in a student ID. So once we have this, we're going to use our local session to delete this student. So I'll just come and say that we have to first query for this student. So I'll just come and say student. So we're going to need to say student to delete, and in this case it's going to be equal to get student by ID, and in this case we shall need to get the student by the student ID. Then we're going to use our local session to delete. So I'll say local session delete, and in this case shall say that we're going to delete our student to delete, and then I'll use our local session to commit this. So I'll say local session dot commit, and once we have this, I'm simply going to go ahead, and what I'll try to do is to use that same function. So I'll have to first import it. So I'm just going to come right here and then say that we're going to say that we need to delete the student data. So I'm simply going to come, so it's actually already imported here, but I'll have to remove it. So I'm going to come and basically use that function here. So in this case, the first thing we shall need is a student ID. Now that I've been getting it here, I'll just simply copy it and paste it within here. Have to just fix the indentation, and right after having the student ID, now I'm just simply going to come and say delete student data. So this shall need a student ID, which I'm going to pass in here, and then you shall have to redirect to our home. So I'll just come and say return redirect response. In this case, we are going to redirect to request.url4, and in this case we shall just need to redirect to our HTML endpoint, and we shall also need a status code of 303. So let's actually create a route for this. So I'll just come in here, and all I have to do is to create a route. Sorry for this. So it's going to be a route, and this route is going to be the one for slash delete, and then I'll provide the student ID. So I'll just come and say delete student ID, and in this case the ID will be an integer. So I'll provide our endpoint. This endpoint is going to be the one for deleting student, and I'll basically leave it to that. So I'll go back to our index.html and provide a URL. So in this case, I'll provide, it's actually going to be a var, and then I'll say we're going to have a URL for. So in this case, we shall have delete. In this case, will be student, and then we shall have the same student ID. So I'm just simply going to copy this from here and then provide it just within our URL. So when I save, I'm going to refresh here, and let's try now deleting a student. So I'm going to delete the student. Now we see that that student has been added. So let's try to create a student. Just simply create a student and provide an age, which shall be an integer. I'll provide the registration number and then add the student who is going to be added. Now I can be able to update as well as to be able to delete. So let me try to update. And then our application is actually working, and this is bringing us to the end of this video. I hope you guys have learned a lot, because we've used this video to create a simple application using Starlette. We've looked at some concepts such as routing, query parameters, responses, and requests, and we've also looked at how we can use SQLAlchemy to help us create a simple database. If you like this video, please leave a like, and don't forget to share this video. Comment about what you feel about this video, and I'll be making some more videos about the Starlette framework. Thank you for watching, guys, and see you in the next video. Bye.